I'm in neighboring Essex County, and so I feel part of the larger community. We're going to kind of I'm going to talk to you about the housing first approach, but I think in the context of the data we just heard, it brings to mind one of the predictors of homelessness. I mean, we've talked about it indirectly, but fundamentally, homelessness is all about poverty and all about income disparity. So I like Clark's pointing out that here we are in Bergen County, the richest in many ways, and also how do you explain all of these other people in the community who are extremely poor? And this disparity between rich and poor is actually codified. There's an Italian statistician named Corrado Gini has come up with, he was looking at all kinds of numerical distributions, but economists and sociologists use the Gini coefficient to describe cultures or countries or societies in terms of their income disparity. And so, for example, the United States right now is about a 0.55. It reads very much like a correlation coefficient. So South Africa or Brazil is a 0.72. Europe, in all of its diversity, though, ranges out at about a 0.35. Canada, Australia, 3.2, 3.3. So you get a feel sort of intuitively for the disparity of income distribution in those cultures. And why is this relevant to this conversation? Well, it turns out that the disparity actually predicts a number of things socially. It predicts, for example, the investment societies make in affordable housing, mental health, addiction services, access to health care. The higher the Gini, the less likely you're going to have access to these services. So that in a rather strongly related way, the greater any community or country moves to a disparity that is large, they pay for it, if you will, through a leaving out larger numbers of people that can participate in a productive way in that society. So that when you're thinking about homeless people, it's something about their own personal characteristics or misfortunes or sometimes qualities, but it's often the larger context of where they're living that contributes significantly to why they're homeless. For a long time, in this country, we've had homelessness since the 80s. Some of you have been around to remember Reagan's supply-side economics and the federal government's basically abandonment of building affordable housing. That's what created this particular homeless crisis starting in the 80s, and we began to see people literally on the streets in large numbers. There were always pockets, neighborhoods, the Bowery, but nothing of this magnitude of homelessness. It was really that federal policy that, by the way, has never been reinstated, not through all of the administrations of the Bushes and the Clintons, and even the current administration is talking about some very creative things around fixing problems of homelessness, but nobody is talking about a real federal investment in building affordable housing. And without that recommitment, we will not really end homelessness. And the programs you will hear about today, which are useful and interesting, are really small-scale solutions to the fact that there isn't enough affordable housing, but we have figured out creative ways to help subsets of the population. For example, the population that I primarily work with is the chronically homeless group that has multiple problems. Mental health, addiction primarily, but certainly health problems and poverty as well. One of the things that happened in that early response to homelessness in the 80s, after people began to appear on the street, is that we began to think of the fact that so many of the people on the street that were homeless were also mentally ill. And in a kind of a collective error in illusory correlations, we assumed that the reason that people were homeless was because they were mentally ill. Well, it turns out that actually people were mentally ill before they were homeless. They often had received their diagnosis long before their acute episode of homelessness. And if you look at epidemiological data, most people who are mentally ill are actually not homeless. They're living with families, or people of means or supports are not homeless. The people who were homeless and mentally ill were homeless because they were poor, not because they were mentally ill. Because when you are mentally ill, you're living on a disability income. At that time in the early 80s was about $550 a month. It's in New York City. They're usually adjusted, these numbers, across the country for depending on where you live. $550 today, I think it's about $700. Once you lose your apartment, if you have a mental illness, severe, you're going to be in and out of institutions. You will be admitted and discharged. Landlords who are impatient look to renew, or you can't afford to maintain your rent during your institutional stay, you'll be discharged into homelessness. Homeless, mentally ill, and without money, certainly your monthly rent check will not be able to afford you the first month's rent, security deposit, or anything else that you need to get into an apartment again. So once out of housing, however you manage to get it the first time, once you are homeless and mentally ill, you are essentially priced out of the market. You will not be able to get back into housing. Unless a program shows up that has a rent stipend or some other support, income support. So it's about income that will get you back into housing to begin with. One of the things that we did in response to the homeless, mentally ill, was we assumed that people needed treatment to get back into housing. Because we believed it was their mental illness, not their poverty, as we found out subsequently, we've set up an entire system of care called the continuum of care, where people who have multiple problems must first address these problems in order to get into housing, based on the assumption that it was the problems that caused homelessness to begin with. Well, why would we house someone who's addicted and symptomatic only to lose the housing again? On that premise, many of the programs that HUD currently funds look to treat the mental illness and addiction before they'll give a person access to permanent housing, which is what they want most. So we're spending a lot of time in transitional and acute care services for people who are homeless and have multiple problems, trying to fix their problems before we can house them. The Housing First approach that we developed some 20 years ago and found to be unusually effective actually turns that equation on its head. And not because we were clever enough to actually do it, we were just desperate to try something new. And after talking to people long enough on the street about what their immediate needs and their own sense of what was important to them, and everyone unanimously said, I need a place to live. I've had addiction since high school. I've been mentally ill since my early 20s. I've been homeless only the last 3-4 years. I need a place to stay. So if you had the I don't know what it was really, risk-taking. There is a kind of a sense of an assumed liability to help a person with addiction and mental illness get into an apartment of their own and then have support services in place for them after they're housed. It turns out that this problem of chronically homeless people with multiple problems can be helped just like that. At least their homelessness ends just like that. It ends in the week or two that it takes to find an affordable place to live. And then mental illness and addiction we have not solved, but the support services that either provide services directly to the person or connect them to local community clinics end up to be a very effective way of keeping people housed and in treatment over time. This Housing First approach has initially met with skepticism. It's particularly challenging to implement in a suburban county. Tom Toronto came to New York a few years ago, and we talked about starting a program here. There was a lot of issue. The housing stock is different. It's not like a city where you have all kinds of apartments available. But in some ways, in the planning and anticipation of who will live in the county with us, and are we going to continue to build houses that only a few people can afford, and the people that serve them, or the people that somehow need to be part of it? Are we going to be inclusive in the zoning and housing and all of the other policy issues that create a community that is, in fact, has room at the table for everyone? Because if we don't, and we create communities with huge disparities and gated communities, we will end up isolating ourselves and the problems that inevitably creates. So in terms of an overall quality of life, that needs to be in the mix. There needs to be space for affordable housing, because that's where the solution is to this homeless problem. Housing needs are the same for everyone, whether it's a family, whether it's someone that lost their job, or whether it's someone that's mentally ill. They need a basic, simple apartment. Some people need a lot more support services than others, but the housing piece is all the same. What I find, that's the good news. The good news is that this is actually a completely solvable problem. The difficult part of it is that we need a really serious commitment to building affordable housing. That's sort of on the economic side, but on the personal and value side, who are we and how are we going to live our lives? We need to consider, do we have a mindset that is socially inclusive and allows everyone a place at the table in our community?